when time slowed in a small American town. The day did not rush into Cedar Hollow. It unfolded like a careful hand opening a letter, slow enough that the town could notice every crease. Dawn moved through the streets with a softness that belonged more to memory than to time. The first sound was not a clock or a whistle. It was the low murmur of a coffee pot inside a kitchen where the curtains were still half drawn. The smell drifted through the screen door, mixing with the cool air that carried a trace of cut grass. On the table sat yesterday's paper folded neatly, with a pencil resting across the headlines as if someone had paused mid-thought. Along Main Street, Mr. Dorsey lifted the shutters on his grocery store. He paused a moment to lean on his broom and study the light spilling down between the buildings. He swept once, then again, not because it was needed, but because mornings were meant for small acts of order. Next door, the bakery's ovens glowed. The scent of rising bread made its way into the street, curling under doors and tugging at anyone who might be awake. At the corner, the town's only traffic light blinked a steady amber. It seemed less a command than a reminder that nothing in Cedar Hollow had reason to hurry. A pair of pigeons circled the drugstore roof before settling on the ledge, watching the quiet like old men watching a game they no longer played. Near the river road, the dairy truck rattled past. Bottles chimed in their wooden crates, a thin song of glass and metal. The driver tipped his cap to the mailman, who had just swung onto Birch Lane with his bicycle, the canvas bag already heavy with letters. He rode without looking at the map in his pouch. The names and streets had lived in his memory too long to forget. He knew which families left notes tucked behind porch rails, which windows opened to share a story, and which mailbox hinges squeaked as if guarding secrets. At the diner, Millie leaned across the counter, polishing with a rag that was already clean. The radio hummed with a tune uncertain of whether it wanted to be cheerful or sad. Chrome stools reflected the early light, waiting for familiar faces. In the pie case, lemon meringues sat like a promise the town could depend on. Children had their own rituals. On the curb, a boy lined up marbles in careful rows, then toppled them only to begin again. His dog stretched beside him, tail sweeping the dust. From an upstairs window, a girl dropped a ball of yarn to the porch and laughed when the cat chased it down the steps. By the schoolhouse, the flag hung still, catching only the faintest stir of air. The classrooms were empty, yet alive in their own way. Chalk waited on the tray, erasers rested in a neat line, and desks bore the polish of restless hands from years gone by. On the teacher's desk, a bouquet of daisies leaned in a jar of water, placed the evening before, as if to greet whoever entered first. Everywhere in Cedar Hollow, the morning spoke in small sounds. A porch swing creaked, a screen door echoed, and a radio dial caught a whistle of static before finding a tune. Each sound left room for the next. None tried to speak louder than the others. By 9 o'clock, the town was ready without saying so. Shutters were open, sidewalks were swept, and the bakery's loaves cooled on the racks. The mail was on its way. The ice cream truck idled quietly behind the garage, and the teacher unlocked the school door with her straw handbag tucked close to her side. Nothing extraordinary had happened, yet everything ordinary had begun, and in Cedar Hollow that was enough. The day had opened gently, and the town opened with it. By the time the church bell gave its first ring of the morning, Mr. Pierce had already begun his route. He was not a man who hurried, yet somehow the letters always reached their places on time. His bicycle leaned into the streets as if it had learned the rhythm of his body, steady and patient, moving with the ease of habit. The canvas bag that hung from his shoulder was heavy, but he carried it as though it were no burden at all. The people of Cedar Hollow trusted him more than they trusted most institutions. He was the keeper of news, both joyful and heavy, and he treated each envelope with the same quiet respect. At Mrs. Atkins' gate he paused, knowing she would want to share a story about her sister in Omaha. At the Hamptons' front porch, he tucked a postcard deep into the slats where the sun would never fade the ink. He gave a nod to Mr. Collins, who always pretended not to wait for the post, though his eyes never left the corner until the bicycle arrived. Children followed him sometimes, curious about the magic of his bag. He would let them hold a letter, their fingers tracing the stamp as if it were a treasure from far away. Then he would take it back gently, reminding them that every envelope had a home and a heart waiting behind it. What the townspeople rarely thought about was the way the mailman carried their lives in fragments. He knew who received letters once a week, who had been waiting for months, who was still holding on to hope in the shape of an envelope. He never spoke of these things, but his silence carried a weight that others could feel. His mornings moved like a story told in chapters. At each gate, a new page turned. Sometimes the page carried laughter in the form of a birthday card filled with confetti. Sometimes it carried sorrow in a telegram that made the hands holding it tremble. He was present for both, and in his steady presence, the town found comfort. Mr. Pierce had grown older with the streets themselves. His hair was silver now, his cap softened by sun and rain. The bicycle creaked in familiar places, but he never considered trading it for anything faster. To him, speed was not the point. What mattered was the act of delivering, the ritual of placing something small yet meaningful into waiting hands. As he moved past the diner, Millie waved from behind the counter. He lifted his hand in return, a simple greeting that carried the weight of countless mornings just like this one. Further on, he placed a letter into the wooden box at the Ferguson house. The handwriting was neat, a child's hand trying to stay inside the lines, and he smiled, imagining the delight it would bring. The town watched him without staring. People leaned on fences, nodded from porches, or gave a short wave from across the street. They did not need to thank him aloud. The gratitude lived in the rhythm of their routine, in the way they trusted his knock, in the way they knew that tomorrow, and the day after that, he would appear again. By late morning, the canvas bag grew lighter, and the bicycle tires made softer sounds on the gravel. His work was not dramatic, yet it was the quiet thread that stitched the hours together. Without him, the town would still exist, but it would feel less whole. For Cedar Hollow, the mailman was more than a man on a bicycle. He was the memory of every letter ever written, every word that traveled across miles just to reach a door. And when he rode down the last lane of his route, with the bag nearly empty and the sun higher in the sky, the town felt complete. The day could now continue because its messages had been carried home. By the time the sun had climbed a little higher and the morning shadows had begun to shorten, another sound joined the rhythm of Cedar Hollow. It was lighter than the clang of a screen door, brighter than the chime of the church bell, and more welcome than any clock striking the hour. It was the cheerful ring of a bell, tied to the handle of a cart. Children heard it first. Their heads lifted from marbles and chalk drawings on the sidewalks, their games suspended mid-turn. Coins clinked in small pockets, saved from chores or gathered carefully from the jar on the kitchen shelf. Shoes slapped against the pavement as they ran, calling to one another, eyes shining with the certainty that something sweet was close. The peddler's cart turned the corner slowly, wheels rolling with a familiar squeak. Painted lettering on the side had faded with time, but the children did not notice. To them, it was always new. Inside the wooden compartments sat candy wrapped in paper, sticks of chewing gum stacked neatly, licorice ropes curled like secrets waiting to be unrolled. On hotter days there were glass bottles of soda nestled in ice, the tops ready to pop with a hiss that made mouths water before the first sip. The peddler himself was a man of few words, but his eyes crinkled kindly when he handed over a piece of taffy or a chocolate bar. He had the habit of slipping an extra peppermint to the youngest child, or a newspaper to the old man waiting quietly by the bench. His cart was not only a business, it was a piece of joy on wheels, a traveling reminder that even in the ordinary hours of a town, wonder could arrive. Parents watched from porches, smiling at the excitement. Some shook their heads at the thought of candy spoiling dinners, yet even they could not help but remember the taste of their own childhood when the bell had once called them to the street. The sound carried a thread of memory across generations. Sometimes the peddler sold more than sweets. On certain afternoons he carried small toys, tin whistles, or paper kites folded flat, each one sparking dreams larger than their size. He brought the day's newspaper too, and a bundle of magazines tied with string so that adults had their share of delight alongside the children. The exchange was always simple, a coin pressed into his hand, a small treasure placed into the hands of the child, a thank you given without thinking. But what lingered was more than candy or paper. It was the sound of the bell rolling down the street, the sight of friends comparing what they had bought, the feeling of being part of something that belonged to everyone. When the cart moved on, the children slowly returned to their games, unwrapping sweets or sipping sodas with stained tongues. The peddler's figure grew smaller in the distance, but the echo of the bell remained. In Cedar Hollow, the voice of childhood was not just the laughter of children. It was the peddler's bell, steady and clear, promising that tomorrow or the next day he would return again. And so the town carried on, with sugar on the lips of children and the faint jingle of memory lingering in the summer air. When the bell at the schoolhouse rang, it was not always to gather children for lessons. Sometimes it rang simply to remind the town that learning had a place, steady and waiting, like the sun that rose each morning. The old wooden building stood at the edge of Cedar Hollow, its white paint worn thin by years of wind and rain. Yet inside, the air always carried the scent of chalk and paper, and the walls held the sound of voices that had grown into adults long ago. The teacher was Mrs. Whitcomb, a woman whose hands carried both strength and gentleness. Her gray hair was always pinned neatly, and her shoes carried the dust of 100 walks to and from the same doorway. She had been at the school for so many years that parents often brought their children to sit at the same desks they had once used themselves. Some of the carvings in the wood, initials and small hearts, were her quiet reminders of time's passage. Her mornings began before the students arrived. She would place a bouquet of flowers from her garden into a jar near the window, then open the classroom wide to let the fresh air move through. She arranged the books into neat stacks, smoothed the chalkboard with a clean rag, and laid out the spelling lists in tidy rows. These were simple acts, yet they were part of her ritual, the way she prepared the room not only for learning, but for belonging. When the children entered, she greeted them with a nod that was firm enough to command respect, but kind enough to ease their nerves. Lessons began with reading aloud, voices rising and falling like a choir of uncertain notes. Arithmetic followed, the sound of pencils scratching in rhythm. Outside, bird song and the hum of the town floated in through the open windows, blending with the voices of youth. What made Mrs. Whitcomb more than a teacher was not only her knowledge, but the way she saw her students. She noticed the child who came to class without breakfast and quietly slipped a biscuit into a desk. She noticed the shy girl who never raised her hand and gave her the gentlest encouragement until her voice found courage. She noticed the boy who struggled with writing and placed extra sheets of paper in his satchel, telling him that practice was simply patience in disguise. The children carried her lessons beyond the classroom. Years later, when they worked in shops or fields, when they raised families or served in distant places, they remembered her words. Some remembered the poems she made them recite. Others remembered the way she spoke of history as though it was not dates on a page, but lives that had once breathed just like theirs. All remembered the feeling that they mattered in her sight. In the evenings, when the school grew quiet and the last child had gone home, she often remained at her desk. She would grade papers by the soft light of the lamp, or mend a torn book cover with careful stitches of glue and cloth. Outside, the crickets sang, and the town moved on with its life. Yet inside the little schoolhouse, memory was being written in small, unseen ways. For Cedar Hollow, Mrs. Whitcomb was more than an educator. She was a thread woven into every family, a keeper of lessons and of dignity. The children who once filled her classroom might forget arithmetic tables or spelling lists, but they never forgot the way she looked at them, as if each was worth the effort of her time. When she walked home along the path lined with elms, carrying her straw handbag and perhaps a book tucked under her arm, the town seemed a little steadier. It was not simply that she had taught the children, but that she had taught them all in quiet ways how to belong to one another. The afternoon in Cedar Hollow moved with the calm of water in a slow river. People sat on porches with glasses of iced tea. The barber swept his floor for the second time, though no one asked him to, and the sound of children's laughter floated in and out of the quiet like a song carried by the breeze. Then, when no one expected it, a bus that rarely stopped let a single passenger step down onto the edge of Main Street. The stranger stood still for a moment, as if deciding whether to enter the day or remain apart from it. His suit was light brown and carried the look of travel, his shoes polished but dusted by the road, and his briefcase held tight at his side. He glanced once at the water tower, then at the storefronts, before his eyes settled on the diner where Millie was moving behind the counter. The bell above the door gave its usual cheerful ring as he stepped inside. Conversations quieted, not out of suspicion but out of curiosity. In a town where every face was known, an unfamiliar one was reason enough to pause. The stranger removed his hat, cleared his throat, and asked if breakfast was still being served. Millie nodded and told him that breakfast lasted as long as anyone needed it to. He smiled at that answer, not just with his lips, but with a visible relief in his shoulders, as though he had been waiting for permission to rest. He chose a booth near the window, ordered eggs and coffee, and sat in silence while the town gently studied him. Old Mr. Reeves sipped his cup without comment, but watched from the corner of his eye. A few children pressed their noses against the glass before running off again. The stranger ate slowly, pausing often to look out at the street, as if measuring it against a memory. When Millie asked his name, he hesitated. Finally he said, "Matthew," and after a breath he added, "Matt Delaney." He explained that the bus had broken down a few miles back, and this stop had not been on his plan. Millie nodded, remarking that sometimes life broke something on purpose, just so a person would sit still. He gave a small laugh, one that carried both agreement and something unspoken. Later, as the sun softened over the park, Matt walked toward the old oak tree near the swing set. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, worn at the edges. It showed two children laughing on that very swing, captured many summers ago. He traced the creases of the photo with his thumb, and for a moment the years seemed to fold back upon themselves. Ruby from the diner happened to pass by and noticed the picture. She recognized the park, and when Matt told her it had been taken in 1939, she smiled with a kind of knowing. They sat together on the bench, sharing fragments of memory. He spoke of a summer spent in Cedar Hollow as a boy, of mud forts and afternoons that felt endless. She spoke of the same park, of her brother, and of how some places did not fade but simply waited. Their conversation was quiet, but in that quiet the town seemed to listen as well. As evening drew near, the bus returned to collect passengers. Matt stood at the stop, briefcase in hand, yet before stepping aboard he turned back. He looked once more at the diner window, at the children chasing marbles in the dust, at the oak tree standing with its initials carved faintly in the bark. He raised a hand in a simple gesture of thanks. Ruby, watching from the doorway, lifted her hand in return. When the bus pulled away, Cedar Hollow did not feel abandoned. Instead, it felt as though something had been left behind, a reminder that even strangers carry pieces of the past, and sometimes they return them when we least expect it. The town settled again into its slow rhythm, but now with the gentle awareness that memory could arrive in the shape of a traveler with a photograph in his pocket. As the sun lowered itself gently across the rooftops of Cedar Hollow, the town grew quiet in the way that only small places know. The mail had been delivered, the children had finished their sweets, the schoolhouse windows had been closed for the evening, and the bus with its single passenger had already vanished beyond the fields. What lingered was not the sound of footsteps or the smell of bread cooling on racks, but the presence of people who carried memory in the way they lived their days. The mailman moved down the last street with his empty bag, nodding to a neighbor as if to say that tomorrow would arrive just as faithfully. His work was simple, yet it was through him that hope and sorrow crossed the thresholds of homes, and the town understood that without his steady hand their stories would be scattered. The peddler pushed his cart back toward the edge of the road, the bell quiet now, the compartments half empty. Children waved after him, their tongues colored by sweets, and he waved back with a smile that had no need of words. To them, he was not just a seller, but the voice of summer afternoons, the proof that joy could roll into town on squeaky wheels. The teacher walked the path beneath the elm trees, her handbag swinging lightly at her side. She carried no papers tonight, only the calm of a woman who had spent her hours shaping the minds and hearts of the young. The schoolhouse behind her stood silent, but within its walls lived the echoes of lessons that would ripple outward long after the chalk had faded from the board, and the stranger, though gone, had left his presence behind. His photograph, his quiet smile at the diner, his pause at the oak tree, all had reminded Cedar Hollow that memory does not belong only to those who remain. Sometimes it is returned by someone passing through, someone who reminds the town of who it once was and still is. When evening spread its soft colors across the horizon, Cedar Hollow did not look extraordinary. It looked ordinary in the most comforting way. Yet in the movements of these four figures, the town held something sacred. The mailman who carried their words, the peddler who gave them sweetness, the teacher who planted understanding, and the stranger who awakened memory. Together they formed the quiet pulse of a place where time seemed willing to slow. As lamps flickered on and porches filled with the hush of conversation, the town breathed in the truth that life was not measured by grand events. It was measured by the people who gave it rhythm, who filled its hours with meaning so subtle that only later, when the years had passed, would one realize how much it mattered. Cedar Hollow closed its eyes with the evening, not as a town of buildings and streets, but as a town of people who kept one another's stories alive. And in that stillness, memory settled, gentle and lasting, waiting to be remembered again.